Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast.
Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Katie.
And Katie, boy, this is a big one today. This is our first AMA, Ask Me Anything. And did people deliver?
They sure did. Yeah, if you didn't hear, we sent out a form a couple weeks ago and we said we were looking for people to tell us their fears in endurance training and racing. So that's the topic of today. And we were overwhelmed with how many people got back to us. So thank you so much to everyone who submitted your fears.
And this is very smart and thoughtful questions. And I think these are all questions that I think every question is going to resonate with everybody because they all seem very universal.
Yes, they do. So hopefully this is an episode for whether you're training for a 5K or an Ironman, or you're just listening along. I think that you can get something out of fears in endurance training and racing. But before that, I think we should get into our favorite starting segment, which is coaching and training insights.
I.e., what did we learn this week?
We learned a lot, believe it or not. So I guess I'll jump in first. I am finally back on the East Coast after being traveling for a really long time. I was in Utah, I was in California, I was in Arizona, really exploring the American West for a lot of different things I had going on. And it's really good to be home. But I think I picked up some interesting insights while I was traveling. And one of the first ones that came up for me was the effects of training at altitude. So while I was in Utah, I was sleeping at around 6,000 feet and spending most of the day between 6,000 and 7,000 feet above sea level, which is a lot higher than Boston, Massachusetts, or the Upper Valley, or these places where I spend most of my time. And I did a little bit of skiing while I was there, but I was also kind of really trying to follow my training plan. And it was really interesting to experience that altitude training. So I picked up a couple of interesting insights that none of these are revolutionary. And if you've trained at altitude before, you've probably experienced this. But at least in my experience, you should expect that your heart rate is going to be higher during workouts for a lot less effort. So slower paces, your heart rate is still going to be kind of jacked up. And your perceived effort could be a lot harder too. And that's simply because there's less oxygen at higher elevations as compared to sea level. And so you want to not be going necessarily based on things like pace and power while you're at altitude, because it's just not a fair apples to apples comparison. You might also notice that your recovery metrics are a little bit off. So I found that my resting heart rate went up a little bit. My sleep quality was a little bit worse. It still wasn't as bad as when my life stress was really high, as we talked about, but I could notice that there was something a little bit different going on there. But all that said, the great thing about training at altitude is that when you return to sea level, you feel like an absolute superhuman. So I came back home, and then the last week, my workouts have just felt fantastic. My sleep has been great. My resting heart rate has been down. And I think that might be a reflection of a little bit of the boost that I got from altitude. So if you're going somewhere with altitude, I'd say cut yourself some slack, but also consider using it as an opportunity to get some good training in. And then when you get home, you're going to feel pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. So it's funny. We have a number of athletes who are training here, in the Northeast. And then they sign up for Ironman Boulder and go out there and race at 5,000, 6,000 feet. And I think people are psyched because Boulder's a great place to go to. But then they don't realize it's pretty high up. And it's like you just pointed out, you do lose a certain percentage of aerobic capacity at that, even at 5,000, 6,000 feet, maybe 5 or 10%. What do you estimate?
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. And I think it's important to keep in mind that if you're signing up for a race at altitude, it's a little bit risky to never spend any time at altitude and then show up there, unless you're going in with really just kind of completion goals, or that your paces are going to be different in racing than training. I find that mentally that can be a little bit demoralizing if you're looking down at your watch and you're like, what is going on right now? And I think you and I both experienced that actually when we raced at St. George and trained there. That's only at maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet. And even so, we could feel the difference. So the point here is altitude really does matter, and you should think about it strategically. If you live somewhere that's high altitude, lucky you, that's awesome. You can totally race there because you do adapt over time. But I think most of our listeners are here in the Northeast.
So if you live in the Northeast, do you recommend sleeping on a bunk bed on the top bunk during altitude training? Is that what you do?
For sure. Everyone needs to get a bunk bed right now. That's our gear pick of the week.
Exactly.
Okay, next insight for me. So a couple weeks ago, I coined the term reset days, where I was talking about how on a rest day, sometimes your life stress can still be really high, and then you might not actually be getting the benefits of a rest day. And during all my travels, despite the fact that travel is stressful, I did actually have a lot of really nice reset days, which I appreciated, where I wasn't doing as much work. It was sort of just a chill day with friends or family. I was watching a movie or hanging out, just really sort of unstructured training. And my Oura Ring, which I love, I've talked about this before on Gear Pick of the Week, does a pretty good job of capturing daytime stress levels. So their algorithm for daytime stress takes heart rate variability, just the amount of motion that you're doing and body temperature into account. And so it tells you during the day, like, you are stressed or you are engaged, which means like slightly stressed, but not too bad, or restored or relaxed. There's these different metrics. And I kind of didn't believe the whole stress algorithm while I was very stressed out, because every single day it told me that I was highly stressed. And I was like, there's no way I can be stressed all the time. But in the last few weeks, as I've taken more time to just chill out and not be like productive all of the time, you know, you can think that while you're sitting working, like, oh, this isn't stressful, I'm just sitting here, but it still is physiologically affecting you. So I think I learned from this experience, maybe I and others probably need more time for just truly unstructured chill time. That's like watching TV or sitting on the couch or hanging out with your friends, or just really, really not having to work or work out all the time. And in that, I think something that I've been trying to do, I'll bring this up a little bit later, I think with our challenge of the week, but I think it's really important to try to say no to more things. As endurance athletes, you've taken on a really, really big commitment. And so whenever you can cut things out, just because you can do them doesn't necessarily mean you should. And now I'm very motivated to keep that like restored Oura Ring metric here, because I can just tell how much better I feel. And I think there really is something to it.
Yeah, it's just terrific advice. Less is more oftentimes with us type AAA triathletes or ultra runners. Yes.
Exactly. Actually, this reminds me of a quote that you've always told me, Jim, which if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. I think that really applies here. So think about your week and your day and use more no to say yes to things like restoring yourself, hanging out, and being pretty chill.
Yeah, I love that. But then I heard the other way to think about that is if somebody says, hey, do you want to do this? And if it's in the future, you're often willing to say, oh, sure, I'll be happy to like go to like, I don't know, your fundraiser or just whatever it is, right? Something like, I'll be polite. Yeah, it's in the, but if you say, if you put it on your calendar tomorrow, so would you be happy to go tomorrow to like, I don't know, again, the fundraiser or whatever it is that they're like kind of marginal. Maybe I do want to do that. Maybe I don't want to do it. But if it's on your calendar tomorrow, how do you feel about it? Because if it's on your calendar 2 months from now, you probably feel a little bit differently about it.
I love that. All right, we're going to use both of those. So fold that into a challenge of the week. It's a big one. Okay, last thing is I'm going to share two insights from strength training. So as a lot of you know, I've been taking strength training a lot more seriously in the past year, working with this really awesome strength trainer. Shout out to Annalise at Boom Team Fitness. She's really amazing. But two insights that I've picked up from this really targeted strength training are, number one, even though I think my aerobic volume has been a little bit lower than it was, say, this time last year, I have felt stronger than ever in terms of things like hill running or speed. And I think that's almost entirely because of strength training. So we've been doing a lot of work in the gym that is preparing me for a race like Sea to Summit, which is a lot of power-based exercises. And the other day I did a hill workout. It was 12 by 1 minute hills, hard up, probably about a 5K pace uphill. And I felt stronger than ever doing a hill workout. And it blew my mind because I have come off life stress and travel and honestly not a lot of consistency. But I could feel basically just my entire body, my posterior chain engaging the whole time. And I was like, wow, if you're short on time and you really can't prioritize like 4-hour rides, that might be okay if you are getting really, really good strength training in. And then of course, you need zone 2, you need to scale that volume up, but don't skip your strength is my biggest upshot from that experience.
Yeah, we're huge strength, as everybody keeps mentioning us on this podcast. Like, yeah, we love strength, we love strength. And something also you said, which is engaging your posterior chain, which is interesting because that's a little bit different. Like engagement is different than strength. But really that engagement is such a key thing as well. And that awareness can come from many different things, you know, probably yoga and other things. But I think strength training for both of us really seems to be the best way to get awareness around that area.
Absolutely. And then my final insight related to strength training is also in the context right after this hill workout that I just told you about, I went and lifted. And we've talked about before how sometimes it can be good to stack your strength workouts after something hard because then you get a true off day the day after. But anyway, I went to the gym. I'm working with my trainer and she had me do some weighted single leg step ups. So I was holding probably about 25% of my body weight in 2 dumbbells that were racked on my shoulders. I was stepping up onto a very high step with a single leg and then lowering that bottom leg down, tapping it, not pushing off. And it was really, really, really hard. And even in just the first set, especially after doing hills, I found myself getting almost a little bit panicky about it. Like, I don't know if I can do this. This is kind of freaking me out. It's really, really hard. And then I finished. I did the 10 reps and I turned her and I told her that. And she said, well, you just held your breath for all 10 reps. You weren't breathing at all whatsoever. And it was such a simple thing that I never would have noticed myself. But then the next set, she just breathed with me. She had me like breathe in and breathe out on the inhale and the exhale as I went up and down. And I had no problems whatsoever. So we've talked about breathing in the context of stress. I'm also going to remind everyone, breathe in the context of your workouts, because sometimes when something gets hard, I think we all have an instinct to just like freeze and hold our breath. That is going to make everything so much worse. So if you can just have one kind of mantra during these things, make sure to breathe. It's super important.
So good. That's so good. Also, do you feel like I've been playing around with this a little bit this week, was lifting after running, but also coming back from a run and just feeling a little bit tight everywhere, and then using strength work also to sort of work out the kinks, if you will. Like, so I don't know, are you feeling that as well too?
I like that a lot. I'm always pretty nervous about going into a strength session right after a hard run, because I'm like, I don't really know how this is going to go. But I have to say, both this week doing that, I did a hard strength after a swim and a hard strength after a run. Both times, I think I felt better coming out of the strength workout. Certainly worked. I was done for the day after that double, but I think it actually made me feel better too. And keep in mind, when you do your strength workout, you can always be warming up with some more mobility-focused exercises. For example, doing a deadlift motion without any weight, that's a great way to warm up for your deadlifts, and that's a great way to work on mobility. So 100% agree with that.
Yeah, and it's such a great feeling. Like, you've done your aerobic work, you've done your hill work, and now you're doing your strength work, and you walk out of the gym just going, I feel fantastic, and I've done the work. Like, just like it's like a win-win-win across the board. It's awesome.
I love it too. Such a good feeling. All right, on to you, Jim. What are your coaching and training insights for the week?
Okay, so this week, so we got a little bit of snow up here this week, or last weekend up here. So ski season was extended, for better or for worse. And for the worst part was I fell down cross-country skiing. I came down a really steep hill, and the sun had been baking on the slope, and my ski went right down to the ground. So I went from about 15 miles an hour to a 0 on my head. So,
no.
So suffered a little, but my ear pods stayed in, which was fantastic. So there goes, shout out to Apple.
Your pick of the week. Shout out to Apple AirPods.
Exactly. It's my preferred concussion earpods. So I did, yeah. So it turns out I did get probably a slight concussion, had sort of headache and sort of some of the classic signs. And I was sort of like, yeah, it's fine, whatever. I probably have had concussions in the past. And Katie, you and I have done some concussion training for the Dartmouth Tri Club, so have a sense of what to look for. And I was taking it somewhat seriously, but then I was talking to my healthcare provider, and she said, you have to take this very, very, very seriously. She said, you will go home now. You will not be on your screens. You will do this. You'll eat this. You'll drink this. Da, da, da. And I took that advice. And kind of like you talked about with the reset days, I took a really deep, like 4-hour nap, and I just really took it super easy, no screens, and just took it seriously. And it was like, and it felt like that was a deep level of recovery that I focused on. And so, yeah, it just turns out that after a couple of days, I felt fantastic. And one of the warnings that my healthcare provider had said, hey, if you don't take care of it now, it's going to come back again and again and next week. And so just a reminder here to, if you bump your head, take it easy. It's okay. I'd had a huge week that I'd put in all these 3-hour rides. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to bump my fitness this week. And then I just all this took to a backseat. I just wiped it off the training piece. Said, okay, let's just change the plan. Let's just get better. And I feel great a couple of days later. So
awesome. I'm really glad that you're doing okay. And yeah, concussions are super scary. We've had athletes have them before, and it's something that you don't want to mess around with. And actually something that came out of that you were saying, Jim, is like a reset day for anything. It could be a head injury. It could be just a niggle. It could be something else. Your Achilles is hurting or your knee's bothering you. There's something so powerful about just a couple days off and not letting it turn into like this, I sort of recovered, but now I can only do medium training for the next 3 weeks. Just don't let that happen. Take those 1 to 2 days. We have a great episode on injury prevention, and we talk a lot about that. So I'm glad that you did that. I'm glad that you're doing okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you. My second insight of the week was I ran across this guy it's called The Inner Runner, and we put a link here in the show notes. And it's this guy, Lawrence Van Lingam. He's South African, but I think he lives in Boulder now. Of course, everybody lives in Boulder. He's a little bit of an eccentric guy, it seems like, but he's sort of an exercise physiologist and has a lot of really cool videos. But he's got this free program I put a link to. It's called 10 running cues to transform your running. And I was sort of a sucker. I'm like, let me check it out. But some of the stuff he has in there is really interesting. One of them is just this backward walking and a certain way of backward walking during your warm-up. And he also has this thing called the awesomizer, which is kind of a funny term, but it's a way of sort of opening up your hips and activating your toes and stretching out your hamstring all at once. So I put a link in the show notes for YouTube for that. Check it out. And I've noticed a pretty big difference, honestly, with just, I've done less of a dynamic warm-up and more of sort of this backward walking, the awesomizer, along with some of the things that we have in our run drills, like high knees and a few other things. But I've really incorporated this, and it's made actually a pretty big difference in my running. My running wasn't good beforehand, so maybe now it's just sort of like, okay.
No, I love that. I think that's really good. And I think the idea of just backwards walking, it's so easy. It's just like the 5-minute walk warm up. Just turn around and do some of that backwards, and knowing that that's pretty easy to do, I think is great. I've actually had a couple athletes who maybe have jumped into the drills a little fast without having a walk warm up and have like tweaked something because they're skipping and doing all this really, really dynamic plyometric stuff. I still think you should do that if you're doing, say, a track workout, but you better have like walked and jogged for 5 to 15 minutes or even longer beforehand. So I love that this one's super easy, and I'll definitely have to check it out.
Yeah, great. Okay, that's it for that's all I learned this week.
That's pretty good. I mean, you learn something in the context of being concussed, so I'm fairly impressed. But I think you're right that now it's time to transition to our episode on fears. So again, this was a Google form. It was a single question. We just asked our listeners and our community, what are you afraid of when it comes to endurance training and racing? And you all responded with just such important and thoughtful insights. And so we went through and we tried to categorize them into a bunch of different broad categories, and then we're going to kind of drill through and talk about each one. But before we do that, Jim, do you want to go over what the 5 buckets that we created are in terms of these fears?
Sure. Yeah, it was really interesting because these questions came in and we're like, how do we organize these things? And actually, this was a great exercise because I had never really thought of like how we coach people in sort of these buckets or these rings, if you will. And I actually ran across this in a book by John Morton, who's a former Dartmouth ski coach and Olympian. Anyway, so he, in like the first maybe 5 pages of his book, he said, here's the 5 components of cross-country ski training. And I was like, oh, this is the same as triathlon. So I sort of borrowed this, if you will, from John. So the first one is just really training and conditioning. This is the one we talk about a lot. This is the physiology. This is the actual workouts themselves. And this is the way to get you aerobically and metabolically fit and durable in race ready. So we're all very, very familiar with just training and conditioning. The second one here is mental training. And I have to say most of the questions that you guys sent us were around this topic. So I'll spend a lot of time on this one. But again, this is training and racing, mental skills, cultivating a mastery mindset, balancing passion versus obsession, which is really hard. We'll talk about that. It's confidence, it's persistence, it's grit, it's patience, whatever you want to call it. Facing our fears and seeing them as growth opportunities. The third one is technique and skills. Again, we spend a lot of time on this, whether it's swimming technique or run drills, which you just mentioned, or bike handling, to any kind of race skills. As triathletes, we just have so many skills we have to learn. It's a little bit overwhelming, actually, how many skills we have to learn. And the fourth one is nutrition and health, covering everything from health and proper day-to-day nutrition and hydration to racing and training. And the fifth one is our favorite, which is equipment and gear, which we all love. So,
well done, but we might be scared of. That came through.
We may be scared of it. So yes, so gear is, we love it, we have it, but we also need to know how to use it and maintain it. So those are really our 5 buckets, or sort of our interlocking rings, if you will. You can think of the Olympic rings, and so each one of these fits in these. And then those rings all collate into a bigger ring, which is really called endurance racing.
Exactly. And I feel like we have a lot of great examples. So what we're going to do is probably read a couple of quotes as we go through, but usually we'll just summarize what the fear was, and we'll share our perspective on it. We'll share some stories around it, and I think we'll go from there. So to get us started in training and conditioning, a lot of people talked about a very valid fear of just catastrophic injury, which is so relevant in sport because, the sports that we do put us at risk sometimes for injuries. And in a couple of different episodes before, both injury prevention and our interview with Neil McKenzie, who's a wonderful physical therapist, definitely check that episode out if you missed it. We talked about that there are 2 different types of injuries. So you could have like an acute or traumatic injury, or you could have an overuse injury. And for folks who are afraid of overuse injuries, what I like about overuse injuries is that usually you have some warning signs and you can do more things to avoid these. So being in tune with your body and stopping if you feel stuff coming on, and of course, fueling well and getting your recovery in and doing your mobility work, all of that stuff can help you avoid overuse injuries. That's not to say that they're not scary. And when they happen, it can feel like the end of the world. But keep in mind that you have a ton of tools to be able to avoid those. I think when people are talking about fear of injury, most of the time it is sort of this greater fear of an acute or traumatic injury, because those can be harder to predict. And if you're riding your bike down the street and you get hit by a car, you can't always control what other cars are going to do. And in general, I think anything that's fear-inducing or anxiety-inducing a lot of the time can come from uncertainty. So I think we're going to drill into that a little bit more. But again, if you're concerned about those overuse injuries, you want to refer to those other episodes and think about what you can do to steel yourself against that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think sometimes we forget about what kind of risk we put ourselves in. Just through all the different sports and all the different conditions and terrains and modalities that we move in, that injuries are going to be something that's inevitably going to happen. And ironically, I think most of my worst sports injuries have actually happened not in sports, but actually outside of sports. But they are related to sports. So, for example, I had was it April of 2019 when we were all training for Ironman Lake Placid, deep into the build. Yeah, I can't wait to go express all my fitness at Lake Placid. And then I popped a disc moving a mattress. And that was super hard. It's very, very hard. It sort of maybe goes into some of the mental skills, the psychology of stuff. But it just was really, really hard to think, oh my God, I've wasted all this time and energy. And now I'm hurt. And so just to remind myself that, I was able to eventually recover. I did recover. And yeah, I didn't race that year, but the rest of the summer I had tons of great fitness. So you don't lose all your fitness. You still have some of your fitness. And so it's a setback, but it's not a fatality.
Exactly. Yeah. And we've had so many of our athletes and friends go through really serious traumatic injuries in the context of whether it's a bike crash or moving a mattress or anything like that. It can happen. And sometimes this is the hardest thing to do, but being grateful that you're still there. These things can be really, really dangerous. And we've heard horror stories that are a lot worse. So sometimes I think that gratitude practice can come in, although it sucks. I'm not gonna gloss over the fact that it's terrible. I think if we want to think a little bit about how to manage this fear of, acute or traumatic injuries, I think it came through a lot, especially in the context of bike crashes. And usually what I do to remind myself is, there is this baseline understanding that life is dangerous. Driving your car is really dangerous. And walking down the street in a city, jaywalking, stuff like that, it can all be pretty dangerous. Cycling is dangerous too, but I think it's helpful to, number one, take as many precautions as you can for safety, especially in terms of bike safety. We've said time and time again, you need to get one of the Garmin Vario radar lights. That's a great way to know if cars are coming up behind you. If not that, you should at least have a blinky light on. You should be wearing bright colors, so don't pick an all-black cycling kit. Have bright yellow, bright orange, anything like that makes it easier for people to see you. Try to not ride during rush hour. Try to ride in areas that are safer. Even if you do the same boring 5-mile loop over and over again, if there's not a lot of cars on it and there's a good shoulder, that's really helpful. And then, of course, maintain your bike. Sometimes people don't have a well-maintained bike, and it can break if you're going out there on a bike that's not well-serviced and your brakes fail. So all of that is a great place to start. And then I think the other thing that I always try to do is just make sure and kind of check yourself in thinking about whether your sport is really the only thing in your life that matters. So when you're healthy, it actually can be helpful to ask yourself, what would I do tomorrow if I had a catastrophic injury and I broke both my legs and I couldn't do my sport? And of course, you'd be really bummed out. But if you can't think of anything else that fills your cup, now is a good time to actually kind of be investing those things. So we think athletes are kind of healthier and happier when they have other hobbies too. And of course, it's hard to really be, plugged into your music and your art and your cooking and your family time and whatever that is when you're training for an Ironman. But just keeping that bigger picture of being a little bit more well-rounded, I think is helpful, because then you can know, yeah, this can happen. And imagine if it did, I know that I would still be okay. But all this said, it still really sucks. So I think that's just a really valid fear. And we want to say it's shared by so many people in our community. And we're with you because I'm always a little nervous about this too.
Yeah, it's super scary. Actually, I just talked to an athlete this morning who has been out for a number of months. She had a viral infection and couldn't exercise at all. So she went from just, training all the time and all her friends and like all of us training with our friends is such a great part of our social lives. And then it all kind of just went away. And I said, well, what did you do? How did you handle the situation where you went from sort of 100% to zero? And she said, yeah, it just turned out that a lot of my friends, first of all, they came over and they had dinner with me all the time. And I was cooking and I was reading. And she said, I discovered a lot of TV series and stuff. So, but it was just a really interesting question because she's like, yeah, it happened and it was terrible. But, my community was there and I found ways around it. And now she's making a comeback. And so it gets very dark, but there is light at the end of the tunnel as well.
So I think that's good for traumatic injuries. Although if that ever happens to you, we want to hear from you and hear about your experiences and how we can best support you as coaches and within this community. But I think the next one that we could talk about that still falls under this training and conditioning category is a lot of people talked about fears about balance and trade-offs between training and other aspects of life, such as your social life or your family. Related was the fear of just being thought of as selfish if you're going to be pursuing these big goals. And I think that's something that I see super, super commonly in our community, among our athletes, and even among myself as well.
Yeah, I think we referenced this in both the season planning and in So You Want to Do an Ironman episode. Mm-hmm. And one of the top 4 was you have to get your family and friends, everybody on board with your big goal because it is going to be super selfish and you are going to be gone a lot of weekends. And so that's one of the big 4 you have to answer for. So hopefully you're asking that before you actually get into the process. And then I think it's interesting, but if you are more interested in this topic, because it is our curse and our blessing as highly motivated endurance athletes, but there's a great book called The Passion Paradox, and it's by Brad Stolberg and Steve Magnus. And a few of the key takeaways in that book is this thing called harmonious passion, which really hit me, which is like we have this internal drive, love for what we're doing. It's associated with improved health and performance and satisfaction. So that's what we're looking for, harmonious passion. And what we're not looking for is this obsessive passion, which I can also relate to as well. So it's this external validation, the love of results, that kind of thing, Strava posts. And so that's really just associated with like burnout, anxiety, and impressions. So we're really aiming for that harmonious passion part.
I like that. And then to talk a little bit more about balance, this has actually come up a lot in some of our female athlete stories episodes. I think women often feel maybe even more pressure to have balance between like having kids and having a career and doing it all. But I think something that we've pulled out of so many perspectives that we've gotten is that balance is actually kind of overrated. So I've heard people say like balance is bullshit. I love that so much. And one way you can think about this actually is, life is a little bit of a pendulum. And there are times when you can, or maybe, if you're in this community, you've obviously invested some time and energy in preparing for a race or a training event. That is a time where maybe other things might be a little bit out of balance, but hopefully you've gotten buy-in from your community to be able to do that. And you also know that that's not forever. So that's why, at least with season planning for my athletes, even if I know I'm going to be working with them for multiple years, I will say we are taking an off season and I don't want to give you a training plan. I think it's way better if you go out and you just do what you feel like and you invest more time kind of in that family and friends and social and career and all the other buckets. And sometimes that scares people too. I'll put that out there that often people get really nervous about being off plan. But in general, I think that is a great way to check yourself and say like, okay, for 6 months, I'm going to be really, really serious about this one particular goal. But after that, I am going to be way more present in these other domains of my life that matter a lot. I think that that's something to just keep in mind as you're moving through that process.
Yeah, and something I think we'll talk about later in this episode is that, we will be out of balance. I love that. Balance is bullshit because it is true. We are all in creatures. But I think something that really helps is just being self-aware. Even so, when you're even in that 6-month build, and you're really in it. You're really going getting after it. Just being self-aware of the time that you do have available. Whether it's your family or friends, whatever it is, and that just goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. It really does. All right, next one. This is also related to training and preparing is fears of not really knowing where we should be or where we are fitness-wise at various stages of training. So people said, like, I'm always scared because I don't know if I'm falling behind to reach my race goals or if I can tell if I've progressed. I think that is something that may come up for many of our athletes.
Yeah, I get this a lot. This is always, I think it usually comes up in like the second or third conversation I have with most athletes. And they just go, how are we going to know? How are we going to know? And I always say, listen, we're going to know a lot through this process. And there's going to be so much, we're going to see just these patterns in your performance and the data and the metrics. And so I said, when it comes to race day, we're actually going to have a really, really good sense of where you're at. So when you start the process, it is sort of you're going into the unknown and what can I do and what kind of potential do I have? And over time, as coaches, we get a very, very good sense of where you're at. And that's just seeing data day to day. That's also through the, our run tests that we do, our FTP tests. And, so that sets us up in the specific prep phase. So we'll know. And then also we have these race simulations where we go out and you say, okay, I'm going to try to run at X pace or bike at this X percent of my FTP. And we get a chance to really 3 times during those race preps to see, is our theory correct? And so anyway, by the time you end up at race day, we have a really good sense of where you're at.
Mm-hmm. And if you're concerned, you should just ask us because we as coaches do have a pretty good handle on this. And I think it can be hard. This is another fear is just relinquishing control to your coach and assuming that like, okay, my coach has a plan for me, but I promise that we put so much thought into, your training plan and setting that up for realistic race paces. And that's why we do race pace efforts off the bike and on the bike during our race simulations and in that specific prep phase. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, even though that's really hard to do because I promise that we have this one under control and we always love to talk to you about it. All right, last one here for training and conditioning is fears of travel. So once you get really, really into this specific prep phase, it can be really tempting to want to hit every single workout. And then things come up. You have life stuff, you have work travel, you have family events. People ask, how do I kind of overcome that and maximize training while I'm traveling? Am I going to lose everything just because I have to go away for a weekend?
Yeah, and I typically say, yeah, okay, how can I maximize? What can I do? What can I do? What workouts? Can you help me move things around? And I always come back and I go the opposite direction. I say, this is a great time to take some time off. And typically the way, because one is you're just as an endurance athlete, you're always building up a lot of acute and chronic fatigue. And so sometimes these travel days, often travel is very stressful, but there are also opportunities. We don't want to then pile on you need to go to the hotel gym and do your 2-hour HIM by IM workouts. So I always just tell people get to your destination and go for walks and just don't worry about it. And when you get back home, pick right back up. But how do you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, I travel all the time, as we know. And if you're traveling all the time, then you can't just always take all of that time off. But a few things that I pull out are number one thing that's really stressful about travel for me is not knowing where am I going to swim and where am I going to go for a run? I spend a lot of time mapping all that stuff out beforehand. So I'll figure out okay, this is the pool that I'm going to go to. This is their day pass. They are open from 4 to 6 p.m. And this is how I'm going to get there. This is where I'm going to take a run, all of that. So at least that doesn't feel too new. But I would say I similarly really do take the volume and intensity down when I'm traveling, especially somewhere unfamiliar. And what's great is then you often can come back home and actually be ready to really pile on and have a big fitness boost. I experienced that just this week, where last week was pretty chill. I was traveling a lot. I had some good restorative time. And then I hit Monday so hard. And I was like, I am ready. This is going to be an awesome week. And so far, it's been really good. So just think about it kind of as working with your coach to come up with a plan that says, hey, travel is going to be a lighter week anyway. Let's take that as a recovery week. It might still be stressful on you. So keep in mind those reset days. But yeah, I would not try to ever do a 2 to 3 hour ride on a hotel spin bike. That's a great way to tweak your knee and do something really bad.
But in that sense, I want to give a shout out to, I do have a few athletes who, they're long distance athletes and they are road warriors. They're on the road all the time. And so I see these runs from all over the world and spins on hotel bikes. And I thought, oh my gosh, how do you guys do it? But I mean, so shout out to those folks who just keep it going. But it's also, road warrior is sort of part of their lifestyle as well too. So.
Exactly. Yeah. So it all comes down to you and figuring out what works. But I would say the upshot of this fear is you're not going to lose all of your fitness because you went to your brother's wedding for 2 days somewhere and you're going to be okay.
Right. Have a drink, please. And more than one drink. Do some dancing and you put dancing as a TSS and you're.
Yeah. Put it in Training Peaks.
Right.
All right. We're ready to transition to our next bucket of fears. And I think now let's do technique and skills because this stuff came out a lot. And I think it has been, I don't know how many minutes, but we have not even talked about swimming yet. And that came up as a pretty significant fear. So people talked about being afraid of drowning, afraid of just the idea of open water swimming if they haven't done before, afraid of things biting me in the water. That's totally reasonable. And some of this stuff could also be kind of like a mental training topic at the same time. But let's maybe just first talk about this institution of open water swimming that a lot of people are afraid of.
I love this question because it made me think about why is open water swimming, and swimming in general, like you say, it just keeps coming up over and over again. One, because it's part of what we do in our sport, obviously. But number two was, but more importantly, thinking about these buckets, I realized that swimming, and particularly open water swimming, really hits on 4 out of the 5 buckets. And I didn't realize that. I'm always thinking of open water swimming, like how many yards have we done at open water sighting, that kind of things. And as I started breaking it down and looking at these questions and going, okay, so it does have a physical part, obviously, right? Are we training enough? Can we swim the full distance? That's always a question. And it's a lot to swim, whether 1.2 miles or 2.2 miles, whatever it is, right? Or even just Olympic, it's hard to swim that far. So there's a real physical component of it, which we address a lot. But then there's this whole mental part of it. And so with swimming, even in the pool, there's always, especially with new swimmers, I always tell them they're moving their head a lot to breathe, for example. And I'll say, yeah, that's perfectly normal because what's happening, you have 2 parts of your brain, your amygdala, which is like the fight and flight, sort of the primal brain is screaming, saying, my face is in the water, get it out of the water. You got to get breath, right? And then your prefrontal cortex is saying, hey, it's cool, man. We're in a pool. We're learning how to swim. We just rotate and you keep one goggle in, one goggle out. But there's this fight going on in your brain. So of course it's super mental. And then also too, then you throw in deep, dark water in the equation. And again, your amygdala's going hey, I really need to see what's at the bottom of this thing. So it's a huge mental struggle. And then of course there's the skills part of it, being able to naturally sight every 7 to 10 strokes, reading the water, reading the light conditions, where's the sun, the navigation, and avoiding dozens or hundreds of competitors. So huge amounts of skill. And then, of course, our favorite, the gear. What's my correct wetsuit? How should my wetsuit fit? What goggles should I be using? Should I use the same goggles I use in the pool? That kind of thing. So anyway, the 4 buckets: mental, physical, skills, and gear. Open water, it has it all.
Yes, it does. And I think we as coaches, we spend a lot of time, especially with new swimmers who have not actually done open water before. And I want to say it is super, super normal for people to have a full-on panic attack in the water. We see that all the time. I've seen that as a coach. I think early on, definitely experienced that too, being in very, very cold, dark water and just being like, why can't I breathe right now? I really, really can't. And so want to validate that this is a super, super normal fear. I think something that we can do to try to kind of fight this is almost exposure therapy. So at the end of the day, the more time that you spend in open water, the less scary it's going to be. So once we're in your specific prep phase, ideally, we're going to get you into the open water several times. Some people are lucky enough to have an open water source right near where they live. They can get in a couple times a week. We have a handful of athletes that transition to actually just swimming in the open water because they enjoy it and it's not too bad. But the more times you do it, that familiarity is going to breed a lot more comfort. And then in terms of gear and technique, we also will even have you practice with your wetsuit in the pool. It is a little bit different to experience wetsuit swimming, but all of our training in that specific prep phase is making it so that transitioning to the race is just not something that's stressful. So just going through it over and over again, I think can be helpful. While you're in the water, I would say also a few things to keep in mind are use things like mantras, use things like counting, anything that can just distract your mind and ground you, I think is really, really helpful. And don't be afraid if you're really freaking out in the water to switch to some backstroke, switch to some breaststroke. Take a second to just breathe. That's totally fine. It's way better to even float there for a minute than to have to get pulled out of the water because you can't move forward. So you have all the time in the world. You are not going to probably be there longer than they'll let you. With all of our swimmers, you have enough skills to get through it during that time. Don't worry about just chilling out until you feel comfortable if you experience that in a race.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a little panic attack at Ironman St. George a few years ago. And so just as background, like I learned how to swim in Alaska. So I'm very familiar with cold water. We swam in cold water all the time. St. George had really, really cold water, but it wasn't anything I hadn't handled before. But something happened. I got in the water in the first minute. I was like, man, this is not happening. And my head was spinning and I just didn't know what's going on. I didn't realize it was a panic attack. But like you said, I just stopped a couple of times and I just tread water and was like, okay, what's going on? Let's just get recalibrated here. Okay, where are the buoys? Okay, there's an opening to get back in. But it was really, I just didn't expect it. It sort of came out of nowhere. And I'm a fairly experienced open water swimmer. So anyway, so don't feel bad if you start to feel uncomfortable in the water. It can happen to anybody at any point. So that's okay. Like you said, and Katie, like you said, like mantras. I wish I had better mantras saying like, hey, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, or something, some good mantra would probably work.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, yeah, this can happen to really anyone. And I think it always does also come back to that breathing. So it's a vicious cycle where you feel like maybe you get a mouthful of water, you start to breathe faster, then you feel like your chest is tight, then you're panicking, and it's just this cycle. So that's a great time, just like you did, to take a beat and be like, well, if I float on my back, I can breathe. I can get some deep breaths in and just focus on those deep, deep breaths. I think with a wetsuit, sometimes you feel even more a little bit constricted, but at least having this whole set of tools in your toolbox, pull them out if you need to and know that you can always slip over and you'll be totally safe. And one other thing I'll add is it is almost impossible to drown in a wetsuit. They're very buoyant. So you have to try really hard if you want to drown in your wetsuit. Which I think is helpful.
You have to have a number of triathletes push you under for multiple times.
Exactly.
But seriously, you're right. You just float on top. You can just stop and lay on your back and put your arms out, and you're just going to stay on top. Another thing was what I really like a lot is I end up doing breaststroke a lot, and almost every single triathlon race that I do, just because I come around a buoy. I don't have great eyes, so I'm always like, I do a couple breaststrokes and go, okay, where's the buoy? Where's the shore again? Okay, so I probably incorporate breaststroke 4 or 5 times in really any race. So that's a good shout out to just to practice something like that in the pool as well, to just have another stroke that you can go to and say, okay, this is my comfort stroke, okay? Or maybe it's doggy paddle for people, but yeah.
I love that. And actually on this, we should talk for a second. A couple people mentioned fears of non-wetsuit legal swims. So if you're not familiar with this, there are rules where I believe if the water is warmer than like maybe 78 degrees, it's a pretty warm temperature, Ironman says you can't wear a wetsuit. And that is a really valid fear if you like the buoyancy of the wetsuit. If you're used to swimming within an open water, it could be scary not to have it. But keep in mind, actually, that Ironman really doesn't want to have a non-wetsuit legal swim. And it's very rare that actually happens on the Ironman circuit. There are exceptions like Kona, for example, where the water is always going to be 80 degrees and you know that. But again, that's so salty that, and if you've made it to Kona, hopefully you feel pretty good about that open water swimming. But in general, Ironman will do everything they can. So you might hear a lot of drama in that Ironman Facebook group about like, I measured the water and it was 78.1 degrees today. Ironman will literally boat all around the entire lake and find the 1 square inch of water that is just under the threshold and measure it and say that you're fine if they can. So I wouldn't say this is a huge, huge fear for almost all the Ironmans that we're working on. But, you know, at the end of the day, you've done all your pool swimming without a wetsuit, and you can always hop in the open water without one just to see how that feels. If it helps you just feel a little bit more confident about it.
I'm going to say that Ironman knows its audience pretty well.
Ironman hears your fears and they answer to them.
But I also think you're exactly right. Like most of our athletes have done really long sets in the pool without their wetsuit. And so in some ways, I mean, not that I welcome a non-wetsuit if it goes that way, but I often tell my athletes, like, listen, you have done so much pool swimming. You've done 4,000-yard swims without a wetsuit in the pool, and you did terrific. So you have a huge competitive advantage as an endurance drive athlete going into a race that's non-wetsuit.
Definitely. All right, I think we're done with swimming. Whew, that was a lot of swimming, more than our taste is. But a next fear related to technique and skills was fears about transitions. And I don't think we've really talked too much about transitions on this podcast. We absolutely could do probably a full episode on transitions and the transition area, but people said they were afraid of just not really knowing what to do or feeling lost on the day of the race. And I want to say this is a really valid fear. I still have these like fear dreams occasionally. I ironically had one of these dreams, I think it was last night or the night before, where like I come in from the swim and I show up and I realize I didn't set anything up in the transition area. And I'm like, what do I do? My bike isn't here. I don't have bottles. And I'm like mid Ironman. So this is a super, super valid fear. But I'm glad that we have kind of an opportunity now to just talk through what happens in the transition area.
Yeah, I have the same thing. I'm not racing that much, and I still get these dreams of like, what happened? I didn't pack the so and so. Where's my nutrition?
Yeah.
It's super. This is super common, and I still to this day, I don't know how many races I've done. I've done a lot of races, and I still get to a race that I haven't been to, and I look at the transition area and I go, wait, where's swim in? Like, the water's over there. But I will walk through, I'll set my stuff up and then I'll just walk around transition and go out to the swim in area, go, okay, this is where I come running in, okay, for my swim. And then I walk to my bike and then I walk over to the bike out and the run in. So I just walk the entire thing because that just helps me sort of map it in my brain so that I know that, okay, I know it's very logical. These guys, I mean, they have to move a lot of people. So logistically, it's very logical how they set up transitions. But I still always get confused. So anyway, it helps just to walk through the transition.
And you should have that time. You'll probably get to the race venue the day before and you can walk through and visualize like, okay, this is me. I'm exiting the swim and I'm coming in transition and this is where my stuff is. And then something else that we'll do kind of during your specific prep phase. Again, not a lot of athletes are there yet, so we haven't started it. But we actually do some level of transition practice. So you're just familiar with the process of helmet on, bike shoes on, quickly running with your bike out of transition, mounting on that start line. And then you can actually reverse that. You can dismount at the line. You can run off with the bike, take off your helmet, take off your bike shoes, all of that. I've had people literally set up a transition area in their driveway if they're particularly concerned about it. And especially for short course races where people really are kind of gunning for seconds rather than minutes, I think it's important to feel really confident in your transitions. But if you are going into your A race, this is also another reason to sign up for some shorter races beforehand where you can afford to make mistakes. If it's a B race or a C race where you just don't really care what happens, it's okay to make those mistakes in transition. And I'm actually gonna call out our dear coach Kevin here because Kevin did his first triathlon was an Ironman. His second triathlon, I believe, or third after Kona was a 70.3. And Kevin made a couple of mistakes in transition that cost him actually the podium win, where he had a faster swim, bike, and run than the guy that beat him. But he made a couple of mistakes in transition and lost those minutes in the transition area. And of course, Kevin is one of the best athletes that we know, so I know he won't really mind me poking fun at this. But it just goes to show that it really does matter. And just with a little bit of practice, that's something that can be avoided. So ideally, you don't learn from experience. But again, we can practice this just as well as we can practice nutrition and race-based intervals and all of that. And again, practicing it, I think, really helps you feel less scared.
Yeah. Poor Kevin. Womp, womp, womp.
Womp, womp.
But yes, we all have these transition stories. But what's interesting is that we always do a transition clinic, right, with the Dartmouth Triathlon Club before our first season opener. And it is really interesting because we have a little mountain line and we have the bikes over here leaning up against cars on the ground. And the first transition is usually super messy and people are running around and they're mounting their bikes in the wrong places. It's just sort of chaos. But what's interesting, after the maybe that we do it like 4 or 5 times. By the 5th time, people look like professionals coming in and doing it. So it's just one of these things that it's super confusing. The first couple ones are really awkward. And then by 4 or 5 small transitions, you're like, oh, yeah, I know how to put my shoes on and take my shoes off. It's a little goes a long way.
It does, yeah. And we will probably forecast. We're going to do a race prep episode at some point. We will talk you through literally the minute details of what all that can look like, but we're going to push that one too later on. Okay, last thing we want to talk about for technique and skills is the fear of, training with maybe poor form or poor habits. That's hard when we are not coaches who are generally in person with you all of the time. This could manifest, for example, as just really bad form, maybe also going up too hard on hills and races, just kind of form stuff that you're not really sure if you're doing correctly when you're training alone. And I think that's where we as coaches are actually going to drill into, okay, get me a video, send me a video of what you're doing. Let's figure out if it's a technique issue. I think that can be helpful with, the training alone. And again, we've talked a lot about like get a run evaluation, get a bike fit, do all these things that can help you know that your form is totally locked in. That should lead to good pacing. That should lead to, everything working out on race day. But I think it is also helpful to seek out opportunities to ride with other people because, if they're open-minded and they have a little bit of experience, they might be able to say, hey, like your left knee is doing something kind of weird. And they might not even know what that means, but just gathering data like that, I think is a great way to kind of move forward. All of this said, though, if you are having injuries or niggle, all that stuff, we're going to have warning signs if your form is bad. If you feel amazing and you're really fast, probably your form is not that bad and you don't have too many bad habits. So I wouldn't worry about it too much.
And this also brings up during the specific prep phase, you also see like running intervals, like 2-minute, 3-minute, 4-minute run intervals. So make sure, we don't want you to be a slave to your ground, but do hit the lap button on some of these things. So we can see as coaches, I'm always drilling into people's, a 10K pace or 5K pace, for example, and looking at the splits and going, oh, for 2 minutes, maybe they ran their 7-minute and that's their threshold. But then I saw, oh, wait, the next one's 7:10, next one's 7:20, next one's 7:30. Okay, well, hold on. What's going on here? So was it a hill? Were you feeling okay? Just drilling into like, are you pacing correctly?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Okay, I think that's it for technique and skills. We are moving right along. We had a couple of fears related to nutrition and health, which as we know, nutrition is that 4th leg of the triathlon. So people were concerned about like proper race fueling and the potential for catastrophic GI issues. We've seen that happen on course all the time. And what we can do to avoid that is really important.
Yeah. So I think, for all of us, I've probably laid awake mostly at night with like, what if it doesn't work what I have, right? And often is the case that you have this, so you want to have a plan A and a plan B for nutrition on race day. And what's super common is that you'll train with certain flavor or a certain product all through training, and then you get to race day and you're like, I don't want any of this stuff. Like, what? I don't know. That's a very, very common thing. So what I like to do is in my run bag or mostly my bike special needs bag is to have additional flavors or different products. So you want to have like sort of product A, if you will, and then product B. And if you have a tri-kit or a bento box, you can stuff more calories than you really need onto your person or into your bike so that you've got just lots of options.
Yeah. And again, you can put those options in your different bags and you can practice with them in training. So figure out what like your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice is. And then having all of those available during the race, I think is really helpful. Give yourself a little bit of choice. I would not give yourself much choice on the number of carbs that you're going to take in. But if it's a combination of SIS and Martin and Precision Hydration, any brand, we don't really care. We just want you to hit those grams of carbs. Yep, and again, if you are in the context of a race and you start to have catastrophic GI issues, like it may turn into more of that B day or that C day than you wanted to, but that is also okay. That's where we might need to move into some of that mental reframe or shifting things around because, it doesn't really help to be like, well, I guess I should have tried more products when you're out there losing your lunch. It's not a great place to be. But think about like, okay, what can I salvage here? What can I get down? Can I try Coke at an aid station? Can I do chicken broth? Whatever this is, you're going to need to be creative. And we have seen some really inspiring athletes, have the worst situations and still get across that finish line. So it doesn't need to mean that you're going to stop racing unless it really is going to compromise your health. I think there are always things that you can do to try and take another plan, try to, get some salt down, whatever it is, and move forward.
Yeah, I mean, you say there's so many inspiring stories of people who just had everything go wrong on that day for whatever reason, because racing is so unpredictable, but, have stopped. They physically stop and just say to themselves, okay, I'm at the situation. Like, this is not my A day. This is not my B day. My C day, I'm going to finish this thing. And so walking is okay, asking for help at aid stations, whatever it takes to get there. But I'm always so inspired by people who everything went wrong. I was in every porta potty, and they said, "Did you quit?" No. I kept going. I went all the way. I walked, but I got it done, and they're just so proud. And I was like, "Oh, I'm so proud of you. This is great."
I love that. All right, last one that came up here for nutrition and health is some concerns about things like a changing body or less control of physique when you're optimizing for performance instead of aesthetics. And gotta commend people for calling this out because it is a very real fear, and I'm glad that we can engage with it. I think if I just think a little bit about my own experience and how I think about this, I find that if you are improving your performance and you're fueling that work, those voices do tend to go away. If you're really just knocking off incredible performances every single day, you're hitting those intervals, you're getting faster, you're getting stronger. I have not had a lot of experience with athletes being like, well, I increasingly hate my body, so I don't want to do this, because often these things go together. I think having really, really strong workouts and feeling good in training inspires confidence that can, impact lots of different times in life. So this fear is something that I see a lot more when people are actually embarking on a training plan than when they're deep in that specific prep phase. So I guess my advice would be give it a try. Let's just really focus on optimizing performance and fueling the work super, super well. And I don't think it's as common that that's going to lead to a spiral for aesthetics because these things aren't necessarily at odds. But I think it's really important to call it out. And if it's something that's hard for you, just like voicing that is really, really meaningful and saying like, yeah, these thoughts are here, but also what can I focus on to be really positive about, I think is a nice reframe.
You say fitness is a...
Fitness is a feeling. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Perfect. Yeah. Love it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of feelings, I think we're ready to move to our biggest bucket. And this is a huge episode. This is going to be our longest episode ever. I think we're going on about an hour right now. So we will still give it the time that it needs. And thank you all for listening along. But these comments were all really about the mental side of training. And I've told athletes before, I think completing an Ironman, for example, is like some fraction physical, maybe it's 50 to 60% physical. And I honestly think the rest of it is mental. So it really made sense to me that we got a lot of fears related to the more psychological side.
Right. But I think it's important to say that we're not sports psychologists. We just play one on podcasts.
Exactly. And we've read a lot about it, and we've also had these fears. So that's what we're basically here to share on. But there are some really awesome professionals out there that will kind of talk about in the context of going through all these points.
Yep. So we have a lot of notes here, Katie, and probably just in terms of brevity, we're going to probably skip over some of these here. Yep. But it was just something interesting. I don't know if you guys follow the Barkley Marathon, which is this really crazy race that happens, and I think it's in Tennessee. Anyway, but they had the first female finisher, Jasmine Paris. And she really credits, one, being fit, but number two was just this idea of like, mental skills, just really strong self-belief and finishing this year. So this really bucket is often we think of it as, marginal gains, but really it's maximal gains. So super, super important things.
So maybe to be efficient about the response that we got, I'm just going to fire off a lot of fears that came through on the mental side, and then we can drill into them. But a lot of people use the phrase falling short. So that's a big one, going into a race and not really achieving your goals or not performing to your potential. Another one was related to this is feeling like you've put a ton of energy into getting better at something, but then not actually getting better. So that came up quite a bit. A third one is, maybe not actually just having enough gas at the end. So not being able to get through that finish line, crapping out on the course, you're going all out there and you just can't get through that mental piece of it. Another one, the fear of the DNF, not finishing. So whether it's a race or a long training session, you have that inner monologue that can come through and say like, all right, we've done good work here. We don't need to go up that hill. Let's just call it. Or for example, here's where the half marathon and the marathon fork, let's just do the half marathon, kind of overcoming that inner voice. I think all of those things really fall under this general bucket of just maybe not feeling like you're enough or feeling some level of maybe imposter syndrome or just the feeling of not being able to hit that potential. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how we think about that as coaches.
So the first one of my first thoughts is that, yeah, endurance training, it's very frustrating because it's very slight. It's these very subtle changes over a long period of time. So you can really go months without feeling much faster and much fitter. And then one day, boom, it's just there, right? But that's part of the allure, but it's also part of the frustration. So I just sort of decided to tell people like, we have to be these tiny drops. What I mean by tiny drops of water is that all you have to worry about is that, so the tiny drops form these small puddles, which then become bigger puddles, which then go into streams, which then go into larger streams, which go into rivers, and then goes into the oceans. So we don't need to worry about being an ocean We just need to worry about being like drip by drip, a small little drip of water every day. And eventually that will turn into this ocean, but that's so far literally downstream that we don't have to worry about it. And it will eventually all just lead there.
Yeah. And a lot of people brought up this fear of just like not actually getting better. But we feel confident as your coaches that if you are putting the work in day after day, you are going to get better. And it's not always going to be linear, but just like you said, those little drips are going to eventually reach the ocean. It might be a process that takes more than one race season too. But I think just putting the work in day after day is a nice way to work against the fear of not actually getting better. And keep in mind too that getting better can take a variety of different forms. For some people, that's going to be a faster pace at your half marathon. For some people, that's going to be lowering your life stress, or that's going to be getting better in terms of your endurance fueling, or it's going to be getting better in terms of your balance. All these different things I think work together. So being really realistic about, what are the changes that I've seen over the course of a season. I think it's rare that if you are doing the work that you're going to get worse at everything or stay neutral at everything that we have.
Yeah, what's interesting about swimming, one of the frustrating things about swimming is people say, I've been swimming a lot, but at my base pace or my threshold pace is getting faster. But what's happening is it's just getting easier. So say you're swimming, if your threshold, say like, 140 pace per 100, maybe when you first started, you worked super hard to get to 140s, 10 on 100s on the 140 pace. And then it turns out, 3 or 4 months later, maybe you're still around that 140, but it's just a lot easier just to be in that range. So maybe you're not really getting faster, but it's getting a lot easier. And then it's going to just have a lot less of an impact on your overall energy level at your race.
Exactly. I love that. Related to this, let's talk a little bit about the idea of just not being able to finish the race or totally crapping out of the course or not having the gas to get it to the end of the finish line. I think while this is a valid fear, this is actually sort of a practical thing to be thinking about. I find that if you are pacing well, this is actually not going to happen. If you know to start conservative enough that you can have that strong finish, that is actually going to come through and you probably won't experience just crapping out or hitting the wall. And it can be scary because if you haven't worked with a coach before or you haven't learned to nail pacing before, you may have a lot of experiences where you've gone into a race and just crapped out at the end. And then you might tell yourself, like, this is something about me. I have an issue where I just can't get through those last 3 miles in a half marathon. I can't get that last 5K. In reality, it might just be that you were pacing wrong. So I would try to think about every new race as a blank slate. Whatever happened in the past in terms of your race performances is not actually that relevant because you are here today and your number one goal is going to be to nail that pacing and nail that fueling and just do everything in line with your race plan, which you develop with us. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things we can do as racers is to finish strong. People say, finish strong, negative split it. But so what that really means is I never really understood it until I actually started finishing strong on some of my races. And what happens is when you finish weak in a race, you just kind of want to throw everything out. You look back and you go, I just trained for the 6 months. I finished weak. It felt terrible. I don't know where I went wrong. Where did the plan go wrong? I don't know what to talk about with my coach about because the whole thing just seemed like a failure. But then when you finish strong, you can look back and go, oh, wait a minute, hold on. So I did all these things correctly. Maybe I did, 90% of the things I did correctly, but there's 10% that I can then now identify, say, oh, these are the key places I need to improve. And you can really only get there if you finish strong. You can look back and say, okay, this is constructive, very, very constructive to finish strong. Whereas you finish weak, everything else, the baby goes out with the bathwater.
Exactly. So we can make that a big goal. And that's like with our Ironman athletes, we tell them the number one goal that you need to start with is running the marathon, not walking the marathon. That's another version of finishing strong. So everything that we're going to do in your training plan is helping you avoid that. And knowing again that like your coach is holding your hand here and has a high level plan to help you not crap out at the end, I think that can kind of help.
But I think this also relates back to this inner dialogue. I've had this a lot, right? Like crapping out at the end. I'm not good enough. I'm not strong enough, right? So one thing we really start encouraging people is that in that last 12 weeks as part of your specific prep is to start that sort of that inner dialogue training, right? And developing some of these affirmations and spending some time being mindful because, at the end, I think, humans are just really bad at predicting the future. And there's just all these studies of people stopping at, say, mile 70 at ultra runs, for example, and then about 15 minutes later, just regretting their decisions because it's so hard because in the moment, you're like, this is so painful. There's no way I can go the last 30 miles or any kind of big day. Like I cannot go another, mile here. But if you just take a little bit of time, again, you can even just stop if you want to and just sort of calm down those inner dialogue, those inner demons and say, okay, hold on. I hear you. It's valid, but I actually am pretty fit and I actually can do this and I'm ready to do this. I've prepared to do this. So I acknowledge you, inner demons. I hear you, but you are not me and I can continue on with my race.
Yeah. And this speaks directly to that fear of a DNF, like really getting so bogged down with, I can't finish. I don't know if I can do this, to the point where you actually choose not to finish. And I think we actually talked about this on our live Zoom call the other day with a bunch of our athletes. And something that came out is, yeah, sometimes there's a day where you actually should DNF. If it is a serious concern to your health to be able to continue the race, then that's a really, really good reason to not finish the race. But if it really only is those inner demons that are trying to get you to stop doing the race, we've all certainly been there, but that's something that you want to just not even have be an option. And sometimes it can even be hard to sort through those. But, if you have serious pain just on one side, not just like, oh, my body's really tired and sore, serious pain or other physiological manifestations that indicate you could really, really injure yourself or get, really have something bad happen if you continue, that's totally okay. But let's undo the possibility of having just the talking demons pull you out of that. We don't want a mental DNF. We want those physical ones only when necessary.
I started this a couple of years ago. I started saying this, particularly in long days in the mountains. I say to myself, it's a privilege to suffer. And, or I'd say things like, this is when it got really hard, I'd say, okay, that's great. This is why I came here. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is the way I'm supposed to be feeling right now. I asked to be here. And I knew the day was going to get really hard and it was going to be very difficult. And so I'm like, good. Okay. Thank you. You have arrived. And now I get to really, really work and show who I am. So in some ways I started looking forward to that suffering, but I know when it gets difficult, I'm like, okay, great. We're here. I'm supposed to be here. And then I'd find at the end of those days, as we got closer to the finish, I'd be like, I'm kind of sad it's ending. When usually I didn't have that. I would be like, oh my God, where's the car? I'm just dying here. And now I sort of get a little bit sad going, oh, it's over? Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I get that feeling too. I mean, we talk about the post-race blues, but sometimes you even feel that during the race. You're like, oh, wow, this hurts, but also it's going to be over very soon. And this is the moment where I really experience like the highs and the lows of the whole experience. So I love those mantras. And again, now is like such a good time to be working on your mental game. We're actually going to drop some resources also into the show notes on just building mental toughness and different types of sports psychology and performance. I'd also say if this is really tough for you, there are professionals out there that are sports psychologists, and they're really awesome at giving you the specific skills that you need to be able to overcome these fears. So just like you're going to go to a physical therapist, like don't be afraid to talk to a sports psychologist and say, hey, I have a pretty negative inner dialogue about my race performance, and I think that's what's holding me back. And you can learn how to work against it. So don't think of it as like a fixed thing that you can't control. I think that's something that's actually really exciting to be able to control because it doesn't require any more TSS. It's just sitting on a comfy couch for an hour and talking to someone about how to get stronger there.
And one of the additional resources you put in here, it's something that actually I just purchased yesterday and I started going through yesterday, which is it's called the 12-week Sports Performance and Psychology Training Plans by this guy, Justin Ross, he's a clinical psychologist and he works with a lot of athletes, and it's like $129 and it drops 12 weeks of mental training into your training piece. So it starts next week for me, but just the initial stuff I've read through is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So we'll keep you guys updated on the progress of that. And then I've actually reached out an email to Justin and asked him to come on the podcast for this.
That's awesome. That's super cool. And yeah, I think that is one of the best investments you can do is strengthening your mental game. So highly recommend doing that, and curious to hear your insights as you go through the program. All right, we're going to go rapid fire our very last insight here, but it is an important one. This is a new bucket related to equipment and gear. And a lot of people are afraid of getting a bike mechanical, which I think is really, really valid. The idea of being out on course and having, your derailleur break in half or having a flat tire is really, really frustrating. And I've seen many a racer crying on the side of the road because they have a big bike mechanical. So how do we think about that fear in preparing for race day?
Yeah, I think you said, and we talked about this the other day in the live stream, which was, I think probably 95% of the bike mechanicals you're going to get are just flat tires. And I think the people you see crying are always like, I should have learned how to change a flat. So our number one advice is just, spend some time learning how to change your tires. That's number one. If you do that, you probably take 95%. The rest, there's some random things that will happen. And the other thing that sort of I recommend you doing is just get curious about your bike. And really that can just be wiping down your bike after every single ride and lubing the chain and start to look at your bike and go, hey, where does this, I look at my bike and I'd be like, where does this chain go? What's it doing? But if you start cleaning your bike, and you start looking around and going, oh, wait, that connects to that connects to that. They're very logical machines. And you'll just learn a lot by just doing some really bike maintenance. And another thing about bike maintenance is it just prevents so many things from happening, like a snap chain or whatever. So a clean bike is a fast bike, but it also is just like, it's a healthy bike. It will continue to run.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And then 2 things I'll add to avoiding a bike mechanical are we always have our athletes do a pre-race gear check on their bike where they're going to go out after arriving at the race course. So if they've taken their bike apart in travel, it can get bumped in the car, whatever it is. We always have you go out for that 30 to 60 minute super easy spin, shift through all your gears, test your brakes, and just make sure everything feels fine. You don't want to travel and then put it together and throw your bike in the transition area because there could be an issue with it and you want to get that fixed beforehand. And then also make sure that you have all the things that you need to change a tire. Don't just assume that your saddlebag from 3 years ago has everything that you need. I think of it as an insurance policy where I'm always going to bring a tube and a CO2 and a tire lever and a CO2 inflator in my gear bag. And I tell myself that if I do that, I won't get a flat. So far, so good. It could certainly happen at any time, but I wouldn't just chance it and hope for the best or hope that someone else can help you, because even if you do need to get some help out there on the course, you want to have all your tools with you.
So you do that reverse psychology on your bike. You say, I've got everything, so I dare you to get a flat.
I dare you. Yeah, exactly.
So far worked.
I'm not a psychologist, but I play one on the podcast.
Yeah,
so.
right.
All right, we did it. Wow, this has been a lot. I think we should still do our listener questions because they're super important, and we're going to rapid fire, and then we'll do our challenge and our gear. So, listener questions. Number 1, athletes ask me this all the time, but we tell them you can move your workouts around just like Scrabble tiles and Training Peaks, but are there any principles that they should be thinking about when moving workouts? So a couple things that I always tell my athletes is, in general, unless I want you to do, a long run the day after a long bike on tired legs, I wouldn't do hard things back to back. So doing like a VO2 bike and then the next day doing a track workout, that's going to be a lot of load. If you can avoid it, it's a little bit better to have an easier day in between those. I usually avoid heavy lifting the day before hard sessions. So, I wouldn't lift heavy on a Friday if you have your really hard race simulation on a Saturday, because that can leave you pretty sore. And I do always give people an easier day after and before that weekend brick workout, just because Saturday, Sunday tend to be pretty heavy for our athletes. So if you follow those principles, other than that, you should be totally fine to flip your Tuesday swim to Thursday or whatever that is.
Yep, 100%. Like I say, there's many roads to Rome, but there's just a few things that we, like you just outlined, that we try to apply to every situation.
All right. Second question. This one's for you, Jim. Why do we taper, and how do we think about designing the perfect taper? Because
what taper?
Taper. I don't know her.
Exactly right. Yeah.
But we have some athletes who are actually getting ready. I have an athlete racing at 70.3 Oceanside. So next week is race week for her, and she is in the taper time. So how do we think about that?
Nice. So what's funny, I know we're getting close to race season because I had a bunch of people, a number of athletes recently who usually don't email me with training theory. And suddenly they had very strong feelings on training theory, particularly around tapering, and some very specific recommendations for me to take into consideration on that tapering. So I'm like, it must be race season. But anyway, so just in general, like endurance athletes, we're experts at ignoring acute and chronic fatigue. So these athletes are basically, they were signaling saying, I don't feel tired. I want to keep going hard until my race. I'm like, okay, hold on. We've seen this many times. Like, you have to shed. So we're just trying to shed acute fatigue and chronic fatigue. And acute fatigue usually feel quite a bit like, I'm just tired, I take a nap. But this chronic fatigue, we've been layering it on over and over again for months and months and months. And that's the stuff you really typically don't feel. So that's the stuff that we're just trying to shed, because that's what's really going to allow you to express your true fitness. People train, it's funny because people may look at their big weekend workouts and judge everything based upon their big weekend workouts, but they forget that they've had a pretty big size load Monday through Friday as well too. So again, we're just going to try to take all that acute fatigue, that chronic fatigue, try to shed it, and then we're going to give you aerobic system, which usually about 10 days to really fully heal up. So that's, we'd rather be 10% undertrained than 1% overtrained. And none of our athletes are going to actually be 10% undertrained. But yeah, so we just want to shed fatigue. You don't feel the fatigue. That's okay. That's our job. Leave it to us.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. And I think you told me once, I used to be very resistant to the taper, but have had great success with doing it very seriously. And I think you told me, like, if you don't feel like a caged animal the day or two before your race, you haven't tapered enough. So you want to feel so over energized that you're just like chomping at the bit, ready to run into the arena. And in my experience, the harder I taper, the better that I've done. It is going to be different person to person, but you all underestimate how much chronic fatigue you're holding right now.
I thought this week I was talking to an athlete. I said, Ironman needs to have a village that opens up like 4 days before the race, where all of the tapered athletes can go and just be jerks to each other and just get them away from their families. Just like put them in complete isolation, put them in a hotel somewhere and say, that's the taper hotel. Do not go in there. It's just a bunch of angry Ironman people.
They need like a padded room and like a ball pit and that type of stuff to just release energy. Yeah, it's pretty. Just apologize to your family in advance for how you're going to be during the taper. But if you're doing that, you're doing it correctly. Okay, rapid fire challenge of the week. Mine, I mentioned it before. I want you to say no to one thing that isn't a hell yes and use that extra time to have some restorative moments. Just chill out and don't do anything that's productive.
And mine's a little bit off base here, but just something I experienced this week just was complimenting or thanking a service worker, because there's so many people doing all kinds of stuff, getting her coffee or sandwiches, whatever it is, and just taking a few moments to say, hey, thanks a lot. I just really appreciate that.
I love that. Yeah. Are coaches service workers? Do we count? Are you asking for thank yous from the athletes?
Exactly.
That's pretty good.
If you get this far in our podcast, that's thanks enough.
That sure is. Okay. Gear pick of the week, our favorite. I'm actually super excited about this gear piece, so I'm glad that I threw it in. But I'm going to recommend the Polar Verity Sense heart rate monitor. And drum roll, please, this is a heart rate monitor that actually goes on your arm. So it's not a chest strap. And I was a little bit skeptical because it is an optical sensor, but I've been using it now for about a month. And number one, I think it's accurate because I did some testing and compared it with my chest strap. Number two, I no longer have like a bleeding line of chafe on my chest from my chest heart rate strap, which has been an issue for me in the past. So I'm really excited about it. It's nice that it's on the arm. It's really comfortable. It's subtle. It charges through a USB in your computer rather than having to switch out the battery, which is nice because I'm always like, where are my CR032 batteries? And it's worked really, really well. So highly recommend that if you hate the chest strap. It seems to be a lot more accurate than wrist heart rate, even though it's an optical sensor.
Cool. I'm going to check that out. Okay. My pick this week is Nathan Zipster Max, which is basically just this running belt that you can put your phone in and maybe a little bit of snacks in. Just that really thin belt that goes around your waist. And it's a very low profile. So check that out. And I don't know, it also may be a gateway drug to fanny pack. So maybe
oh man, are you in your fanny pack era?
I know, I might be like fanny pack guy like in a couple months. Like I started with the Zipster Max and now I went to the fanny pack. So anyway, I might be that guy. Yeah. So anyway.
Listen closely to the gear pick of the week. I think we're gonna have to end the podcast if you ever try to recommend a fanny pack on here. But I'll have the Zipster Max. I actually have a similar belt. It's by a company called Flip Belt, very similar on Amazon. But anything like that is a great way to carry your phone and your gear and listen to the podcast while you're running.
Podcast. Or just having somebody want to take a picture. So it's always been like, what do I do with my phone when I run? So I've really been enjoying this. So.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll add really quick, I know we're running over, is it's not great to hold your phone in your hand. That is actually a weight and it can kind of mess up your upper body gait. So I would probably not do that unless you can avoid it. Stick it in that pouch. I'll stick a phone like in a sports bra sometimes if I don't have my pouch, but the pouch is the way to go.
Nice.
All right, we did it. This is long. Thank you guys for hanging on. We will take your feedback. If this was way too long, you should let us know, and we will cut ourselves off mid-sentence. But thank you so much for listening. It's a super important topic. And more broadly, thank you for your engagement with our forum and your vulnerable responses. I think we learned so much from you and got so many ideas that hopefully we'll do some more of these AMAs going forward and just crowdsource some topics because we love hearing from you all, and we're super grateful.
Thanks, peeps.